Welcome everyone. So welcome to Fox and Raven's Bones, our virtual fireside storytelling event. Today we are doing the story of Gilgamesh. And this is known as the oldest recorded story in the world. Doesn't mean it is the oldest story, but it's the first story to have actually been written down on tablets back in about 3000 BCE. And it is an epic tale. It's like the tale of the Odyssey. It is full of all kinds of battles and gods and mischievity, and a lot of profound wisdom is found in this tale. And I believe it consists of about 12 different books. We are obviously not going to go over all of those. I'm going to kind of condense the story into some of the main themes, and then we'll draw out some of those deeper meanings. So a little background on the story. I want you to kind of consider this. So this is a story that comes from Sumeria in Mesopotamia, which is basically present-day Iraq, where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers comes from. It created this really fertile land. And amongst this land, there was a city called Ulrich. Now, Ulrich is one of the oldest cities in the world. And at this time, we believe it had about 80,000 to 100,000 people. And this was a real city. And this city was ruled by a king named Gilgamesh. And this was a real character. And what I'm finding out, a lot of these stories that this Gilgamesh comes in, a lot of the stories of the Bible actually draw their stories from this epic tale. From the flood to Eden to the snake to all these different tales. And it's really amazing because this is about 3,500 years before they actually did the Council of Nicene, where they actually decided what stories actually go into the Bible. So this is 3,500 years before this. All right. So with that, I'm going to kind of go into the story here. So long ago, there was the city of Uruk. And Uruk was in this very fertile land. And this king of Uruk was called Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh was known to be about 2/3 God and 1/3 man. He was born of the gods, but he wasn't quite God himself. But he had supernatural powers. And it had been said that he was a well-schooled and well-knowledgeable king. But he was a tyrant. Nobody liked Gilgamesh. People actually hated Gilgamesh. He put all kinds of laws and regulations on the people. He had laws where when a couple was first getting married, the woman would first have to sleep with him. He wouldn't allow sons to return to their fathers. He was basically a slave driver. And so the people would cry up to the gods, to Anu. Anu was known as the god of gods, is known as the great ancestor gods, which is found throughout history. And they say, please bring us someone to match Gilgamesh and destroy his reign of terror. So after a while, the gods heard their pleas and looked down and says, yeah, this Gilgamesh, he needs someone to kind of balance him out, because he's basically representing all this toxic masculinity, right? Just about aggression. And so from the deep wilds of the forest, they gathered up some clay and they molded a man named Inkadoo. Inkadoo was a man of the wild. He had long, dread, shabby hair. It said he even had horns, and he lived amongst the wild. He drank from the pools and the rivers with the deers and the bears. He lived in rhythm with the cycles of the seasons. He was the man of the wilderness, and he was part God and part man and part clay of the wild forest. Now a trapper was out doing his rounds when he saw Inkadoo, and he reported him back to Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh knew exactly who he was. He's like, God, this is the man the gods had sent to destroy me. And so he had a courtesan the most famous courtesan of all the realm, go out to seduce Inkadoo, to tame him and domesticate him. So there Inkadoo was out in the wild when suddenly he sees this very beautiful woman, the soft skin, the sweetness of lips, the type of scent he had never smelled in the forest before. And he felt a stirring inside of him, something he hadn't experienced before. And they did mad, wild lovemaking for about 7 days. So much did their spirits weave together that something changed in Inkadoo. He wasn't quite as wild. And when he went back to the pools to drink the water with the deers and the bears and the animals, they noticed there was a shift in him. And they didn't want to drink directly next to him anymore. And he realized he was no longer just of the wild. And he was right there in the threshold between worlds. And so this woman, she says, well, come back with me. Come back with me and be a part of the humans as well. And feeling that stirring in his heart, he agreed, and he came back, and he even took on a job. He became a shepherd, and he began to earn some money and begin to take care of this woman. And one day when he was out and about in the marketplace, he discovered who Gilgamesh was. He discovered he was a tyrant. And when he heard how he forced the women to first lay with him than their husbands, what he did to suppress the people, he became angry. He says, that is not right. That is unjust. So in the marketplace, there was Gilgamesh. And he called Gilgamesh out. He says, Gilgamesh, you must come. I challenge you to a great battle. Gilgamesh had been waiting for this. And they started to wrestle right there in the marketplace. Now, the marketplace is also known as one of the threshold places in the kingdom. It's where many worlds meet and come, but there are never the exact center of the city. And so it was in this in-between space amongst all the people that they gathered, and Inkadoo and Gilgamesh wrestled and battled all day long until finally Inkadoo says, I see that I cannot beat you, but that you cannot beat me either. They were at a standstill. Neither could win over the other. But during the battle, they became very close friends. Because through the sense of battle, you get a sense to know who a person is, who their values are, who their character is. And so they fast became very close brothers. Some even say they became lovers. Now, Inkadoo brought something to Gilgamesh that Gilgamesh never had. He brought in a new sensitivity. He brought in a new sense of relationship, a sense of values and honors. And Gilgamesh brought something to Inkadoo. He brought a sense of adventure, a sense of that masculinity of needing to go out and conquer. And so those two worlds began to mesh between Inkadoo and Gilgamesh. So much so that there was a time when Gilgamesh decided he wanted to do something for his people. There was a great forest far away that held the great elder cedar trees. There were no cedars amongst the kingdom of Uruk. And so Gilgamesh says, we should go, we should conquer the god Hamababa. Hamababa is the god who protects the cedar groves, and he is notorious for killing any person who goes there and wreaking havoc on the lands around. This was the story that Gilgamesh was sharing. Now Inkadoo says, I don't think that's a good idea. I know Hamababa. He's very fierce. He could hear the sound of a single deer stepping 60 leagues away. We should not even go through it. But Gilgamesh convinced Inkadoo. Now Inkadoo, they're getting close. So his values and his systems were starting to mesh. He wanted to be in that closeness, and he started to find that gray of where does he take that stand. So they go off, and they travel for 3 days. That would normally take an average man a month and a half to journey. And they arrive into the forest. And once there, Gilgamesh starts to talk to Hanababa, starts to offer him all these special gifts and all these special boons. In the meantime, Gilgamesh actually had many of his men come in and start cutting down the cedars to bring them back to the city. Once Hanababa discovered what was actually happening, that Gilgamesh was just tricking him, the great battle began to unfold, and they started wrestling and battling. But amongst that battle, something happened to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh suddenly did not want to kill Hanababa. Something about Hanababa and seeing that he was the god protector of these old cedars shifted in him. He said, we shouldn't kill him, Inkadoo. Inkadoo says, well, we started the battle. We have to kill him now, because if we don't, he's definitely going to kill us and do much more. I am the man of the wilderness. I know who Hanababa is. Now that we've started, we must follow through. Now, with great regret, Gilgamesh finally agreed, and they actually killed Hanababa. And they took all the cedar back to the city. And the people rejoiced in having the cedar trees brought back to them. Now, Gilgamesh was struggling at this point. He was starting to feel something different. He was starting to feel the sense of relationship with nature, the sense of balance. He never felt these kinds of things before. And he was a little surprised by Inkadoo beginning to adapt his old characteristics. Now, when they came back, something kind of funny happened. Maybe it was funny. But the goddess Ishtar fell in love with Gilgamesh. Now, if you don't know who Ishtar is, she is the goddess of spring. She is the original reason why we celebrate Easter. And the goddess Ishtar fell in love with Gilgamesh and says, hey, Gilgamesh, I want to be your wife. And Gilgamesh says, well, I don't think so. Your last few husbands all died and not too well. So I'm not interested. Ishtar, she was a bit offended. And so she goes back and talks to her dad, Anu, who is known as the great ancestor deity. She's like, Gilgamesh has insulted me. I want something to happen to him. And Anu says, no, just you gotta get over it. But she starts having this major tantrum, the kind of tantrum that a young teenage girl would be proud of, right? She would brag about, all right? To the point, Anu finally agrees to release the bowl of heaven down on the city of Uruk. Now, this was a mighty bowl, and just a single snort would bring down buildings. A single stomp would create the earth itself to give way, and people by the hundreds would disappear. So Gilgamesh and Inkadoo go out there and they battle this bull, and they kill the bull. Now, the gods, even though they saw what was happening, they were a little upset that they killed the bull. They didn't ask permission to kill this bull. This was the property of the gods. And so there was supposed to be a certain amount of etiquette before they could actually kill it. And so they said, well, there has to be some type of reprimands. One of you has to die. And as they were there, the dreaming world started to enter into Inkadoo. And Inkadoo went deeper within himself to where the netherworlds began to take hold. And Inkadoo passed. Now, this is an interesting part of the story. This is where the major parts of this story in the books really take place. In that moment when Inkadoo dies, Gilgamesh grieves. His heart is broken. He has the whole kingdom grieve. The wilderness grieves. All the land grieves for Inkadoo. And in that moment, Gilgamesh recognizes his own mortality, that someday he's going to die. So he basically enters what we would say in today's age, a midlife crisis. He starts to realize his own mortality. He's like, well, how have I been living? And he starts thinking of Inkadoo and how he lived and how he had his code of the forest and the sense of relationships. And so he goes on this great pilgrimage. He leaves the city and he goes off into the wilderness for vision quest. As he out there, he realizes that, I don't want to die. I think I can get the gods to give me immortality. I know of a man who was graced immortality by the gods. I'm going to seek him out. So he goes off into these distant mountains where he has to battle these great lions. And he comes to the entrance of a cave that is guarded by these scorpion men. They're half scorpion and they're half men. And they greet Gilgamesh and say, Gilgamesh, why are you here? And he tells the story, I am coming to greet the immortal, so I too can become immortal. And the scorpion man says, Gilgamesh, this is not possible. You're going to fail on this journey. You should go back to the kingdom and tend to your people. But Gilgamesh is insistent, so they're like, okay, pass. So he goes into the entrance and goes deep into the darkness of the mountains. And once there, he actually has to race the sun. He has to race the sun across the universe through this special space where he's basically in the worlds between worlds. And he makes it out on the other side just before the sun arrives. And there he enters this other world, the world where flowers bloom gems and stones, where there are great fruits he had never seen before. And he comes down to a village, and there in the village is a tavern. Now he's looking disheveled. He's been living out in the wilderness for months. And when the bartender sees him, she's a little afraid. She's like, whoa, what's your story? What's going on with you? Gilgamesh tells the story. And the bartendress, well, she's kind of the one who first really just tells Gilgamesh. She's like, Gilgamesh, you're a fool. You can't do this. Like, she's just upfront like a lot of bartenders are. She's like, you are a fool. You're not going to gain immortality. They're not going to give that to you. Give that up. This is what you do, Gilgamesh. We are given this life as immortals so that life will end, so that this moment and this life will be precious to us. For when you become immortal, you forget to take for granted. You forget to take advantage of all that this life has to offer you in this moment. Go. Find a wife, love your wife, drink good wine, love on your people of your kingdom. Do all that is necessary to live a good life. Go and do this, Gilgamesh. Now, Gilgamesh, he still is like, no, I am going to find immortality. Seeing that, he is resolved, says, okay, boy, this is where the ferryman is. Go there now. So he goes down, he finds the ferryman. And he convinces the ferryman to take him across the sea of death to the island where the immortal Nishapiti lives. Now, this is an arduous journey, and normally, again, this is a journey that would take about a month and a half to take, but because he was part God, it took him only 3 days. But once they were out there in the dark, black sea of death, they had to take these great boughs that he had to break down from the forest and move through. And he had to take his shirt off and put it up on the sails so that the wind would catch it and blow them the rest of the way to the island. And once he's there, he finally met the immortal. But of course, once he was there, the immortal says, Ganesh, or Gilgamesh, he's like, no, you're not getting immortality. There is nothing you can do to gain immortality. He's like, you must go back and tend to your people and enjoy a good life. He basically repeats the same words the bartender says. Go, love your life. Life is meant to end. Life is meant to end, so you really appreciate it. So go and appreciate life and truly live it in a good way. Gilgamesh, trying to be very persistent, the immortal finally says, well, there's one thing that you can do that help bring youthfulness to you. He's like, down at the bottom of the lake, there's a special plant. If you go down there and pluck it, you can take it back with you. And that will help create a sense of youthfulness for you. So you will live a very long time. So Gilgamesh, he swims down into the dark sea. And he finds the plant and comes up and he has it. And with that, the immortal wishes him well, gives him a boat, and sends him across smoothly to the other land. And once he was on the other land, he was having a little bit of fire and he fell asleep. And the serpent, the snake, comes up, sees the plant, eats the plant. And that was the first time a snake shed its skin. And so it gained a sense of youthfulness. And so that plant of youthfulness was stolen from Gilgamesh. Now, this was the last of his walls finally having to come down, and Gilgamesh realized he was simply having to be mortal, and he had to come to grips with that mortality of his own life. And so he started to ask, he started to think about Inkadoo and the wilderness and nature, started to think of Hamababa and the god who protected the forest, began to think of those ways of relationship and all the things that he had learned, how he had gone from this tyrant that had enslaved and persecuted his people to now feeling a sense of needing to nurture his people and create a different life for him and others. And as he was sailing back to his kingdom and he saw those big towers that used to be so impressive to him, he suddenly realized those towers was what blocked the world from nature, blocked them from that relationship with what sustained them. And they became oppressive. So when he went back, he began to change things and he became a good king, or at least a better king. We don't know if he became a good king. And that is the very basic story of Gilgamesh. Boom. Just let that sink in for a minute.